All right, here we go. Andrew Jackson's election here. We're going to look at how much, the extent to which the election of Andrew Jackson resulted in an expansion, an increase of democratic ideals. Democratic ideals would be like voting, the participation of people in democracy, rights, that sort of thing. So over here we have some causes of Andrew Jackson's election. We start to see an increase in voter participation already before this in Western states. They're removing property qualifications to vote and hold office. This is called universal white male suffrage. This means that all white males are allowed to vote. Notice how women are not allowed to vote. African Americans, Native Americans, they are not allowed to vote. Also, you have new state constitutions that are being written in the kind of original states. So not just Western states, but the original states too are changing their constitutions to be a little more universal white male suffrage. And by the time of the election of 1828, the presidential electors that are in the Electoral College, they're chosen by the people, not the state legislatures. So there's less elite influence there. We also have this is kind of the end of the era of good feelings. Back in 1824, we had this corrupt bargain election that really highlighted the differences between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson, like the National Republicans of John Quincy Adams versus the Democratic Republicans of Andrew Jackson. We also have disputes between the North and the South, a regional dispute over the tariffs. The Southerners oppose the tariffs. And then lastly, we have the popularity of Andrew Jackson. He was just a popular figure. He's a war hero at the Battle of New Orleans. So people admired him for that. He was also kind of associated with the common man, and he's the first presidential candidate from the West in Tennessee. Okay, so we have the election. Now, the result of this election, we end up with more organized political parties. This is called the second party system, and it's made up of Democrats and Whigs. So the Federalists are gone, and the Whigs are the new political party. They're not exactly like the Federalists, but they're similar in some ways. They do favor a stronger national government. They do tend to draw their support from the wealthier merchants and businessmen of the Northeast, kind of like the Federalists. So they're sort of similar to them, but they're also anti-Jackson. Henry Clay is going to be one of the major Whigs. Jackson also institutes the spoils system, which was basically rewarding his followers, his supporters, with government jobs. So if you supported Jackson, helped him get elected, he might reward you with a job in government. Because Jackson's point was anybody can do these jobs, so why not have supporters fill them? And you also had national party conventions to select candidates for the presidency. And this reduced the influence of elites. They had the old caucus system, which was like a small gathering of the elites who would decide who the candidates were. These national party conventions allowed anybody to participate. So Andrew Jackson, as president, took pretty aggressive actions as president. In some cases, it was kind of to support the Constitution, and others maybe not so much. So the nullification crisis is one example where Andrew Jackson was strongly supporting the power of the federal government, so supporting the Constitution and the federal government's superiority over state governments. In the nullification crisis, South Carolina was opposed to tariffs, and they were attempting to nullify or ignore the tariffs. You might remember the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions back under John Adams against the Alien and Sedition Acts. So Andrew Jackson actually threatened South Carolina with military force if they tried to nullify these laws. So he's strongly defending the power of the federal government. On the other hand, with the Indian removal, Andrew Jackson actually ignores the Supreme Court in the case of Worcester versus Georgia. This is a John Marshall decision in which that was sided with the Native Americans. Andrew Jackson ignored the Supreme Court. Andrew Jackson also removed money from the Bank of the United States. These are called pet banks, and it weakened the Bank of the United States. So in doing so, he is acting as president against the Bank of the United States, which was legally chartered by the government. So he is basically weakening the Bank of the United States because he hates it so much. Finally, we have Andrew Jackson's common man policies. He advocated for Western expansion, which resulted in the Native Americans being removed to Indian territory, what is now Oklahoma. And as a result of that, obviously you have groups of people that were taken off their land against their will. He also vetoed an attempt to recharter the Bank of the United States. He really strongly disliked the bank. He was suspicious of banks and elites in general. So he really disliked Nicholas Biddle, the guy in charge of the Bank of the United States. Jackson would pretty much stop at nothing to end the bank. And finally, the Democrats kind of represented the common man. They got a lot of their support from small merchants in the Northeast. So, just kind of your lower class, middle class, and also farmers in the West and South that didn't trust banks and other elites as well. So, looking back at these categories, in some of these ways, Andrew Jackson did expand democratic ideals, but in others, he didn't, because as we all know, it's complicated.